They first saw it over Oahu, a pale shape turning inside their formations with impossible ease, and within minutes, American pilots understood that the war they thought they were prepared for was nothing like the one that had arrived. The Mitsubishi A6M0 did not just outperform U.S. fighters, it redefined the sky around them. When the first P-40 Warhawks scrambled during the attack on Pearl Harbor, pilots pushed into climbing turns only to watch the Zero cut across their arc as though ignoring the laws of inertia. In the Philippines a week later, F-4F Wildcats dove into combat expecting a familiar contest of speed and marksmanship, and instead found themselves trying to shoot a target that could pivot, climb, and roll faster than anything they had trained against. It was not simply that the Zero was agile. It was agile in ways American flight schools had taught were physically impossible. Before the war, U.S. instructors emphasized that a fighter could not maintain extreme turn rates without stalling, could not climb steeply at low speeds without bleeding energy, could not reverse direction with a flick of the wrist. The Zero did all of these things, effortlessly, repeatedly, fatally. American pilots accustomed to dogfighting against aircraft that behaved within predictable limits now faced an opponent that seemed unbound by those limits. In the Philippines in December 1941, the 20th Pursuit Squadron launched P-40s to intercept Japanese raids. The first engagements ended in shock. Warhawks dove to gain speed, but the Zero simply followed them down, matching their descent until the Americans had to pull out, whereupon the Japanese fighters zoomed back up the vertical plane with frightening ease. When U.S. pilots tried to turn with them, the battle was over. The Zero's lightweight frame, massive wing area, and absence of armor allowed turn rates no American aircraft could match. P-40s snapped into high-speed stalls. Zeros floated through the same maneuvers as if the air bent to their will. In the Dutch East Indies and a Java Sea, the story repeated. Wildcats and Warhawks jumped Japanese formations thinking altitude or surprise might close the performance gap. But every time, the Zeros could simply outturn, outclimb, or outroll them. American pilots described the sensation with a mixture of awe and dread. One moment they were lining up a shot. The next, the Zero appeared on their tail as if it had teleported. Many did not survive long enough to process what had happened. What made the shock worse was the skill of the men flying them. Unlike the predominantly green American pilots thrown into combat in 1941-42, Japanese naval aviators had been hardened by years of war over China. They entered the Pacific campaign with hundreds of hours of combat experience, mastery of formation tactics, and absolute confidence in a fighter that rewarded precision and punished hesitation. It was not just the Zero that America was unprepared for. It was the people flying it. Early intelligence reports underestimated the aircraft badly. Some analysts insisted the Zero was merely a modified export plane, too lightly built to withstand sustained combat. But as the months passed, wreckage recovered from crashes in the Aleutians and New Guinea revealed the truth. The A6M was a masterpiece of design philosophy diametrically opposed to American thinking. Where U.S. doctrine emphasized armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged airframes, the Zero sacrificed all of this for agility and range. It was lighter, cleaner, and deadlier in a dogfight. The cost was vulnerability to heavy fire, especially .50 caliber rounds. But until American pilots learned how to apply that advantage, it remained theoretical. Meanwhile, the losses mounted. In the Coral Sea, Wildcats tried to meet Zeros in traditional turning engagements and suffered for it. Over Rabaul, P-39s and P-40s attempting horizontal dogfights were outflown, outmaneuvered, and often outnumbered. Guadalcanal was still months away, and at this stage the Americans were learning lessons written in burning aircraft and empty cockpits. Perhaps the most demoralizing realization was that the tactics American pilots had mastered, split S, climbing turn, turning inside the opponent, were exactly the tactics that favored the Zero. The very structure of U.S. aerial combat training worked against them. Some squadron leaders urged their pilots to stay fast, stay high, stay out of turning fights, but without a consistent doctrine, Each engagement became a gamble. Most gambles ended in flames. By early 1942, American pilots understood they were in a crisis. They could not outturn the Zero, could not outclimb it, and could not survive if they tried to fight it on its terms. They were facing an enemy fighter that dictated the geometry of every engagement, one that turned their strengths into weaknesses and their doctrine into liabilities. The question no longer was how to beat the Zero. It was a simpler, harsher question. How do we survive it long enough to learn? The collapse of American air power in the early Pacific War was not due to a lack of courage or numbers. It was due to physics, design philosophy, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the type of air combat the Zero excelled in. In 1941-42, the U.S. Army Air Forces and the U.S. Navy were trained to fight a European-style air war. Fast dives, controlled turns, energy preservation, and engagements decided by firepower rather than acrobatics. The Japanese Navy had prepared for something else entirely, a world where agility ruled the sky, where tight-turning fighters could dictate altitude, angle, and tempo, and where a pilot trained to exploit every ounce of maneuverability could dismantle an opponent before the fight even began. The F-4F Wildcat and P-40 Warhawk were solid machines built around durability and speed in a dive. They were designed to take hits, to bring pilots home, and to deliver heavy 50-caliber firepower. Against many European fighters, these strengths were decisive. Against the A-6M Zero, they were almost irrelevant. The Americans quickly learned the cruel geometry of Zero combat. In a horizontal turn, the A-6M was untouchable. With its enormous wing area, ultralight airframe, and absence of pilot armor or self-sealing tanks, it weighed hundreds of kilograms less than any American fighter it met. This allowed instantaneous pitch changes, blistering turn rates, and the ability to maintain lift at speeds where a P-40 or F-4F would be shaking on the edge of a stall. Pilots reported that the Zero could pivot around its own canopy, changing direction with unreal fluidity. In reality, its design simply allowed maneuvers American aircraft could not imitate without risking structural failure. The P-40 was fast in a dive, but heavy in a turn. The F-4F could absorb punishment, but bled speed quickly. Neither aircraft could follow a Zero through a climbing spiral or a flat scissors. Yet in those first months, American pilots kept trying. Doctrine and instinct told them that the answer to an attack was to turn into it. Against a Bf-109, that worked. Against a Zero, it was suicide. Fully aware of their advantage, Japanese pilots exploited it mercilessly. They would lure Americans into horizontal engagements, then simply tighten the circle until they appeared behind the U.S. fighter's tail, guns already firing. Time and again, American pilots found themselves outflown not because they lacked skill, but because they were attempting maneuvers their aircraft were not built to survive. But the problem ran deeper than design. It was rooted in experience. Japanese naval aviators entered the Pacific War with hundreds of hours of combat over China. They were veterans of dogfights against Soviet-built fighters, of escort missions, strafing runs, and large-scale engagements. Their formation tactics were elegant and practiced, a loose formation doctrine that allowed each pilot freedom to maneuver while maintaining mutual support. American pilots, by contrast, often arrived with barely 200 hours of flight time, little of it in combat conditions. Many had never faced an opponent trained in deflection shooting or high-precision energy management. When confronted with the Zero's mobility, they reacted instinctively rather than tactically, and instinct led them into the teeth of the Japanese advantage. The Zero's endurance also forced the Americans into bad fights. With a combat radius far exceeding anything the U.S. fielded in early 1942, A-6Ms could loiter above airfields, patrol sea lanes, and escort bombers deep into enemy territory. P-40s and F-4Fs with much shorter ranges were forced to climb steeply and engage immediately, often starting battles at a disadvantage in altitude, energy, and numbers. Even the Wildcat's heaviest advantage, its rugged frame, worked against inexperienced pilots.
Many trusted their armor too much, attempting head-on attacks or lingering too long in the Zero's firing envelope. The Japanese cannon, firing 20-millimeter explosive rounds, chewed through metal that American pilots mistakenly assumed would hold. The brutal truth was that Americans were entering turn fights they could not win, co-fights they should never have attempted, and climbs where the Zero's power-to-weight ratio guaranteed supremacy. Tactical missteps amplified the technological gap. Stateside doctrine still emphasized close formations and disciplined turns. In the Pacific, these formations made U.S. fighters predictable. Japanese pilots could split them, isolate one aircraft, and overwhelm it before the others could respond. Meanwhile, American pilots struggled with their own aircraft's limitations. In steep climbs, the P-40 starved for power. In tight loops, the F-4F lost energy too quickly. And in the slow-speed maneuvering the Zero loved, both American aircraft were dangerously exposed. Reports from commanders in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and early Solomon Islands painted the same picture. American fighters could not fight the Zero on its terms. Not in turning speed, not in climb rate, not in low-speed handling, not with the tactics taught before the war. What America needed was not a new airplane, not yet, but a new mindset. Someone had to articulate the truth no pilot wanted to hear. If you try to fight the Zero like a Zero, you will die. And that realization would mark the beginning of the turn in the air war.
By mid-1942, a quiet, desperate intelligence war was unfolding alongside the aerial battles of the Pacific. American pilots already knew what the Zero could do. Now they needed to understand what it couldn't do. It was a search for weaknesses, structural limits, aerodynamic flaws, tactical blind spots, anything that could level the playing field. The first clues came from experience, not engineering. Claire Chennault, leading the American volunteer group in China, had already warned before Pearl Harbor that Japanese fighters would dominate any turning fight. His reports argued that American pilots must rely on diving speed and firepower, not maneuverability. In the Philippines and Dutch East Indies, surviving pilots independently reached the same conclusion. Men who escaped Zero encounters wrote in after-action reports that the enemy fighter shuddered in high-speed dives, that it hesitated when pulled suddenly out of a steep descent, and that its wings trembled at speeds where the P-40 felt rock solid. In other words, the Zero could turn inside anything, but only below certain speeds. Push the fight into the high-speed regime, and the advantage vanished. The breakthrough came in July 1942, when a largely intact Zero crash-landed on Akutan Island in the Aleutians. Recovered and shipped to California, the aircraft underwent exhaustive testing by Navy pilots. What they discovered confirmed every field report. At low and medium speeds, the Zero was unmatched, but at high speeds it became sluggish, unresponsive, even dangerous. Its ailerons stiffened sharply above 250 knots. Its thin wings risked structural flutter in fast dives. Its lack of armor, a deliberate design choice, made it extremely vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire. Even the fuel tanks, praised for minimizing weight, were a liability. They ignited easily when struck by 50 caliber rounds. The Zero was a masterpiece of agility, but that agility came at a price. An American pilot who refused to engage in a horizontal turn fight, who stayed fast and kept altitude, had a fighting chance. Now doctrine needed to catch up with reality. Chennault had already pioneered that doctrine with the Flying Tigers. His P-40s, inferior in turn fights but lethal in dives, relied entirely on hit-and-run tactics. They struck from above at high speed, fired a burst, then climbed or dove away before the Zero could tighten into a turn. Chennault had discovered that the P-40 was strongest when it stayed unpredictable, never sticking around for a second pass unless the situation was perfect. What Chennault knew began spreading across the Pacific in late 1942. Pilots started carrying notes in their cockpits. Never turn with a Zero. Use speed. Hit once. Get out. Attack from above.
The language of aerial combat was changing. The lessons from China and the Aleutians converged. The Zero could be beaten, but only if the Americans refused to fight on the Zero's terms. Energy fighting, once a European concept, began taking shape in the Pacific. The idea was simple but transformative. Altitude was energy. Energy was life. A fighter with more energy, more speed, more altitude, could choose the geometry of the fight. The Zero might dominate the horizontal plane, but it couldn't catch a descending Wildcat or P-40 once they were properly handled. Pilots on Guadalcanal, flying out of Henderson Field, validated the theory in brutal daily combat. The Cactus Air Force, operating under constant pressure, began exploiting the Zero's weaknesses deliberately. Wildcats attacked bombers first, then used their dives to pick off any Zeros too slow to evade. They learned that a shallow climb could bait a Zero upward into an energy trap. The Zero would try to follow, lose too much speed, and momentarily stall its turn rate, leaving it exposed to a slashing attack from a wingman. They recognized that the Zero's incredible roll rate at low speeds degraded sharply as velocity increased. So they pushed the fight fast, always fast. And in those higher speed windows, the Wildcats, so often dismissed as obsolete, became dangerous. Wildcats that had once been helpless against the Zero began scoring kills by simply denying the Japanese pilots their preferred fight. Meanwhile, intelligence officers circulated detailed diagrams showing optimal dive angles, recommended separation maneuvers, and the Zero's compression limits in steep descents. What began as improvisation turned into doctrine. Still, the shift was not immediate or evenly distributed. Many young pilots trained in pre-war turning tactics attempted to outfight the Zero in the horizontal plane and paid for the mistake with their lives. But slowly, squadron by squadron, the truth took hold. The Zero had weaknesses, not in its construction, but in the narrow range of airspeeds where its brilliance existed. Force it out of that envelope, and its legendary maneuverability became irrelevant. By the end of 1942, the Americans were no longer asking whether the Zero was unbeatable. They were asking how to exploit its limits more aggressively. And for the first time since the war began, the Zero did not seem so invincible. The Americans had glimpsed the path forward. Now they would weaponize it.
By late 1942, the Americans no longer viewed the Zero as a supernatural predator, but as a machine with very specific strengths and equally exploitable weaknesses. The problem was not that U.S. fighters were inferior across the board. It was that they had been used in the wrong kind of fight. Now, the fight was about to change. The birth of the new doctrine came not from a single pilot or a single squadron, but from a convergence of necessity and observation. The U.S. Navy's F-4F Wildcat and the Army's P-40 Warhawk shared two qualities the Zero could not match. They were exceptionally fast in a dive, and they held their control authority at high speeds. These traits became the cornerstone of a revolution. Instead of turning with the Zero, American pilots began attacking through the Zero, striking from above at blistering speed, firing a short, disciplined burst, and then diving or climbing away before the Japanese pilot could pivot onto their tail. This was not evasion. This was energy fighting, combat defined by altitude, momentum, and the conservation of speed. To fight vertically was to break the Zero's spine. The shift was most visible at Guadalcanal. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under relentless pressure, had no margin for error. Their Wildcats were slower to climb and less agile, but in the hands of pilots who embraced the new tactics, they became predators of a different kind, heavy, controlled, and deadly in straight-line speed. American pilots developed a new rhythm. Gain altitude, stay high, wait for the Japanese formation to commit to its attack, then dive hard and fast into the fray. The Wildcat could exceed 400 miles per hour in a dive without losing structural integrity. The Zero could not follow safely. The moment the U.S. fighter flashed through, it pulled up into a steep zoom climb.
The Zero, trying to match the maneuver, either overshot or lost too much speed and stalled. That moment of vulnerability was the opening the Americans had lacked since the war began. Tactics once considered radical now became standard. Pilots trained to avoid the Zero's horizontal turn circle at all costs. They used altitude as a weapon, converting height into kinetic energy and then back into altitude in one seamless loop. The Zero relied on sustained turns. The Americans relied on controlled passes. One was about endurance, the other about power. One was acrobatic, the other mathematical. And slowly, the math began to win. Jimmy Thatch, flying F-4Fs in 1942, introduced the most important defensive tactic of the Pacific War, the Thatch weave. Two Wildcats flying side by side would turn toward each other whenever pursued. The Zero, fixated on one target, would drift into the guns of the other. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. Pilots who had once been helpless under Zero pursuit were suddenly able to force the enemy into predictable, lethal paths. The weave was not just a maneuver, it was a philosophy. Fight together, not alone. Even more revolutionary was the insistence that American pilots abandon dogfight instincts. They were taught to fire only when certain of a hit, to disengage without shame the moment their energy state dropped, and to use short bursts of .50 caliber fire rather than spray ammunition in prolonged chases. The new doctrine stressed that survival and positional advantage were the prerequisites to victory, not bravado. The results were immediate. At Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, Wildcats flying high cover tore into Japanese formations with disciplined boom and zoom attacks. At Buna and Port Moresby, P-40 squadrons began executing high-speed slashing passes that left Zero pilots frustrated and often exposed. Again and again, Japanese aviators were forced to abandon their preferred turning engagements because the Americans refused to participate. Every time the Zeros attempted to climb after a diving Wildcat, they bled precious energy and drifted into inefficient flight regimes. Every time they tried to ambush a U.S. formation from above, American high-cover elements struck first. Gradually, the Zero's dominance narrowed. By the time the F-4F-4 variant appeared, with folding wings allowing more aircraft per carrier and improved ammunition capacity, the Wildcat was no longer a victim of circumstance. It had become the foundation of a tactical system designed specifically to break the Zero's advantage. And alongside it flew P-39s, P-40s, and eventually the F-6F Hellcat, all benefiting from a strategic shift in pilot mindset. What truly defeated the Zero was not a better airplane, not yet, but the realization that energy, not agility, was the currency of air combat. Pilots who mastered that truth no longer feared the Zero. They anticipated it. They controlled the geometry of engagements. They chose when and how to strike. By early 1943, the new American playbook was no longer an experiment. It was gospel. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots found themselves on the defensive. Every time the Zeros attempted to climb after a diving Wildcat, they bled precious energy and drifted into inefficient flight regimes. Every time they tried to ambush a U.S. formation from above, American high-cover elements struck first. Gradually, the Zero's dominance narrowed. By the time the F-4F-4 variant appeared, with folding wings allowing more aircraft per carrier and improved ammunition capacity, the Wildcat was no longer a victim of circumstance. It had become the foundation of a tactical system designed specifically to break the Zero's advantage. And alongside it flew P-39s, P-40s, and eventually the F-6F Hellcat, all benefiting from a strategic shift in pilot mindset. What truly defeated the Zero was not a better airplane, not yet, but the realization that energy, not agility, was the currency of air combat. Pilots who mastered that truth no longer feared the Zero. They anticipated it. They controlled the geometry of engagements. They chose when and how to strike. By early 1943, the new American playbook was no longer an experiment. It was gospel. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots found themselves on the defensive. By early 1943, the transformation was unmistakable. The Americans who had once scrambled desperately beneath the Zero's shadow were now flying with a confidence grounded not in optimism but in hard-earned understanding. They no longer tried to outturn the Zero. They no longer allowed themselves to be drawn into horizontal circling contests. They no longer mistook agility for invincibility. Instead, they fought with altitude, speed, teamwork, and discipline. Four elements that, when combined, stripped away the Zero's greatest strength and exposed its fatal weaknesses. The Pacific sky was becoming a different war, and the Zero was no longer the master of it. Nowhere was this shift clearer than at Guadalcanal, where the Cactus Air Force refined its hit-and-run doctrine into a science. Wildcats climbed into layered formations instead of flying scattered and reactive. The highest element stayed untouched, preserving energy for slashing attacks on Japanese fighters diving toward the airfield. Lower elements timed their passes with ruthless efficiency. The Zero, which had once feasted on disorganized American flights, now found itself under attack from angles its pilots had never trained to counter. Its greatest advantage, turning speed, no longer mattered when the Americans refused to stay in the turn long enough for it to take effect. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy formalized the tactics that frontline squadrons had forged in blood. Training manuals circulated across the Pacific. Attack from above, climb away, never dogfight horizontally, keep speed high, maintain mutual support. The thatch weave, once viewed as a desperate improvisation, became standard procedure. Even inexperienced pilots could now survive Zero attacks by flying the weave, dragging the enemy into predictable lines of fire. The tactic neutralized one of Japan's most potent assets, the extraordinary marksmanship of its veteran aviators. No amount of skill could overcome geometry that forced them into an American gun sight. As tactics evolved, so did understanding. Pilots learned to identify the Zero's aerodynamic breaking points. Its aileron stiffened at high speed. It could not match a Wildcat in a steep dive. Its fragile frame crumpled under sustained .50 caliber fire. It lost responsiveness in vertical maneuvers. It lacked armor, making even glancing hits lethal. What had once been mythologized as an unbeatable machine was now treated as what it was, a remarkable dogfighter with narrow performance windows. Force it out of those windows, and it became vulnerable. Force it into a high-speed fight, and it became prey. The Americans also began to exploit the Zero's strategic limitations. Its long combat radius, so impressive early in the war, now became a liability. Long missions meant Japanese pilots often arrived over targets, tired, low on fuel, and unable to chase boom and zoom attacks without risking a flameout. U.S. fighters operating closer to their bases could afford to disengage, climb, and re-enter the fight. With each passing month, the Zero's margin for error shrank. The arrival of new aircraft accelerated the shift. While the F-4F Wildcat and P-40 Warhawk continued to carry the fight, the introduction of the F-6F Hellcat in mid-1943 cemented American dominance. The Hellcat was designed with the Zero in mind. Faster in a dive, stronger in a climb, more heavily armed, better armored, and with a higher roll rate at combat speeds. What mattered most was that the Hellcat was built to fight the way American pilots had learned to fight. It was a vertical combat aircraft for a vertical combat doctrine. And once it reached the front, Japanese pilots discovered that even their best maneuvers could not shake a determined Hellcat pilot flying with tactical discipline. But even before the Hellcat's arrival, the Zero's aura had already been broken, not by technology, but by adaptation. The Americans had shifted from reaction to initiative, from improvisation to system, from fear to mastery. The deeper truth revealed in 1943 was simple and devastating. Japan had built a fighter optimized for the first 6 months of the war, and America had built a learning machine optimized for all the months that followed. The Zero had won its victories through surprise, skill, and maneuverability. The Americans won theirs through analysis, adaptation, and overwhelming capacity to turn lessons into doctrine. By the time the Solomons campaign ended, even veteran Japanese pilots knew the balance had shifted. They saw Wildcats and P-40s fighting smarter, climbing higher, diving harder, refusing every invitation to turn. They watched new pilots, fresh out of U.S. training, employing tactics that had taken Japan years to develop, and improving on them. The Americans had not just survived the Zero, they had outgrown it. And as the Pacific War marched on toward the Central Pacific offensives, the aircraft that once symbolized Japanese aerial dominance became a relic of a moment that had passed. The Zero had been a brilliant design for a specific kind of air war, but America had changed the kind of air war being fought. The sky now belonged to those who controlled the vertical, and the Americans had learned, at last, to fight where the Zero couldn't follow.